The sun was slowly setting as the black SUV moved down the long stretch of road that connected the city to the quiet countryside. The man driving wasn't an ordinary traveler. He was the director of the FBI, a person used to authority, respect, and being in control. Dressed in plain clothes, he was returning from an unannounced visit to one of the Bureau's field offices. It had been a long day, filled with briefings, questions, and endless phone calls. All he wanted now was to reach home, have a warm meal, and rest his mind for a few hours before another demanding day. The highway was mostly empty except for a few cars passing occasionally. He loosened his tie, rolled down the window slightly, and turned up the radio to break the silence. It was one of those evenings that made a person reflect, the kind where the world felt still and thoughts grew louder. He thought about his career, the decisions that brought him here, and the people he had met along the way. He had climbed every step with confidence, earning his place through years of service and discipline. Yet, somewhere inside, there was a growing feeling of distance from the ordinary world that he once belonged to. He barely noticed that he was driving slightly above the speed limit. It wasn't intentional. His mind was elsewhere, lost between the past and present. As he approached a small town intersection, he saw flashing blue and red lights in his rearview mirror. His heart skipped for a second. He wasn't used to being on the receiving end of law enforcement. For a moment, he thought it might be a coincidence. Perhaps the patrol car was heading somewhere else. But the lights stayed behind him, flashing insistently. Then came the siren, a sharp sound that broke through his thoughts. He sighed, pulling the car over to the side of the road. The gravel crunched under the tires as he stopped. He rested his hands on the steering wheel, slightly annoyed. A small-town police officer was now walking toward him, flashlight in hand, the red and blue lights painting the quiet road. The director took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. This was probably just a routine check, he thought. It would be over in a few minutes. The officer tapped gently on the window. The director rolled it down halfway and looked up. The officer appeared young, polite, and professional. "Good evening, sir. License and registration, please," the officer said in a steady tone. The director nodded, reaching slowly for his wallet. He was used to giving orders, not following them. Something about the situation made him uncomfortable. He handed over his driver's license and registration. The officer took them, glancing at the details before walking back to his patrol car. As the officer checked the information, the director stared straight ahead, feeling the tension grow inside him. It wasn't about the ticket. It was about pride. He wasn't used to being questioned or treated like anyone else. In his world, people moved aside when he walked in. A few minutes later, the officer returned. "Sir, it seems you were driving about 12 miles over the limit," the officer explained politely. "I'll need to issue a citation." The director frowned slightly. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, trying to sound calm but firm. The officer shook his head. "No, sir. Should I?" "I'm with the federal government," the director said, leaning back in his seat. "You might want to be careful with how you proceed." The officer's posture remained. The morning after the video went viral, the director woke up earlier than usual. He had barely slept. His phone had been buzzing all night with messages from people he hadn't spoken to in years, some asking what happened, others pretending to care while digging for gossip. The news channels were running the story nonstop. Every station had its own version of what happened during that brief stop on the side of the road. Some called it a misunderstanding, others called it arrogance. Either way, the world was now watching. He sat at his kitchen table staring at a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. His wife tried to comfort him, saying it would blow over soon, but he could tell she didn't fully believe it herself. He turned on the TV, only to see his own face on the screen again, frozen in a moment of tension from the dashcam footage. He quickly turned it off. He didn't want to hear the analysis, the criticism, or the laughter from late-night hosts who had already started making jokes about it. He tried to go about his morning as normally as possible, but everything felt off. Even the drive to his office was heavy with silence. Every traffic light felt longer, every turn sharper. When he entered the FBI headquarters, people greeted him, but the energy was different. The smiles were forced, the nods quick. Some avoided looking at him altogether. The building that had always felt like his domain now felt strange, almost hostile. In his office, he sat behind the massive desk, staring at the city skyline through the large glass window. His assistant came in quietly, placing a few documents on the desk. Her usual cheerful tone was missing. "There's been a request from the Justice Department," she said softly. "They want a written statement about the traffic stop. They said it's just procedural." He nodded without looking up. "Procedural," he repeated under his breath. He knew what that meant. When powerful people said something was just procedural, it usually meant something bigger was already happening behind closed doors. For the rest of the morning, he tried to focus on his work, case reports, budget, reviews, operational updates, but his mind kept drifting back to that night. He remembered the officer's calm voice, the look of quiet confidence. He had dealt with hardened criminals and world leaders, but for some reason, that young officer's face wouldn't leave his thoughts. By midday, a few advisors and senior agents came into his office. They were there to discuss the situation. The tone was formal, almost cold. They spoke carefully, choosing every word like they were stepping through a minefield. One of them said, "Sir, the footage has been viewed over 5 million times in less than 24 hours. There's a lot of public reaction. Some are calling for accountability." The director leaned back in his chair. "Accountability? For what? I was stopped for speeding, and I signed the citation. End of story." "Sir," another agent said gently, "the issue isn't the citation, it's how it looked. People think you tried to use your position to avoid the ticket." He sighed, running a hand over his face. "So now we're judging behavior based on camera angles and online comments?" he said, his voice tired but edged with frustration. The days following the review hearing felt long and heavy. Every morning, the director walked into his office with a practiced calmness. But inside, he knew things were slipping away. The air in the building had changed. People who once stopped by to discuss work now avoided his office unless they had to. Conversations would stop when he walked by. He could feel eyes on him in the hallways, not of admiration like before, but of curiosity and quiet judgment. He tried to act like it didn't bother him, but it did. Deep down, he had always believed that respect was something he had earned through years of service, through every case, every long night, every tough decision. But now it felt like all of that could be undone by one small moment, a brief encounter on a dark road that had become the center of everyone's attention. He spent most of his time buried in paperwork, trying to focus on tasks that once gave him purpose. Reports came in from across the country, cases being solved, operations being planned, yet none of it felt the same. His signature still carried weight, but he could sense that even that authority was beginning to fade. Outside, the public reaction hadn't cooled. News networks still ran stories about him. Some guests on talk shows demanded his resignation. Others defended him, saying he had served too long to be judged by one mistake. But what hurt the most were the headlines that questioned his integrity. He had built his career on that word, and now it was being used against him. One afternoon, he was called into a meeting with the Attorney General. The room was quiet when he walked in. The Attorney General stood by the window, arms crossed, looking serious. After a few moments of silence, the director spoke first. "I know why I'm here," he said softly. "Then you know this isn't easy for anyone," the Attorney General replied. "There's pressure coming from everywhere. The media, Congress, even within the Bureau. They're saying your leadership has become a distraction." The director nodded slowly. He had expected this. "A distraction," he repeated. "I suppose that's one way to put it." "We're not questioning your service," the Attorney General continued carefully. "You've done great things for this country. But perception matters, and right now perception isn't in your favor." The director stared out the window. The city stretched out below them, busy, restless, unaware of the quiet storm brewing in that room. He had always known that leadership came with risks, but he had never imagined that something so small, so ordinary, could bring it all down. "Are you asking me to step down?" he asked finally. There was a long pause before the Attorney General said, "We're asking you to consider it, voluntarily, before it gets to a point where it's taken out of your hands." The morning after the video went viral, the city seemed quieter, but inside the FBI headquarters, there was chaos. Everyone had seen the clip of the director arguing with the police officer during the traffic stop. Agents whispered in hallways, pretending to look busy whenever senior officials passed by. The atmosphere was heavy, filled with uncertainty. The director, once admired and feared, now found himself under a microscope. He arrived at the office earlier than usual that day. Security greeted him with hesitant smiles, unsure how to act around him. He walked straight to his private office, closing the door behind him. On his desk, a stack of reports and media summaries awaited. The top headline read, "Nation Divided Over FBI Director's Behavior." He stared at it for a long moment before tossing it aside. His phone kept ringing. Calls from news outlets, the Department of Justice, and even old friends wanting to offer advice. But he didn't answer. He sat in silence, remembering the look on the officer's face during the stop. For the first time, he began to realize how far pride had taken him. The thought stung deeply, but he pushed it away. By mid-morning, a meeting was called in the conference room. All senior officials were present. As he entered, the room went quiet. Everyone avoided eye contact. One of his deputies began speaking carefully, explaining that the president's advisors were monitoring the situation closely. Public opinion had turned sharply. People saw the director as arrogant and disrespectful. The Deputy Attorney General wanted an internal review immediately. The director sat at the head of the table, listening but saying nothing. His face was calm, but his hands were tightly clasped together. When the meeting ended, he stayed behind, staring out the window. The city skyline stretched before him, bright and indifferent to his troubles. He had spent years fighting crime, managing crises, and protecting national security, yet one short video had undone everything. The morning he decided to submit his resignation, the director woke up early, as he often did. The house was quiet, and the sun had just begun to rise, casting long shadows across the living room. He made himself a cup of coffee and sat by the window, watching the city slowly come to life. For a moment he felt a strange calm, a feeling he hadn't experienced in weeks. The weight of public scrutiny and internal pressure was still there, but it seemed lighter, manageable. He reviewed the resignation letter one last time. It was simple, honest, and free from excuses. He acknowledged his mistakes, expressed gratitude to his colleagues, and emphasized the importance of the Bureau continuing its work without distraction. Nothing grand, nothing defensive. Just the truth. He had spent so long constructing a persona of authority and infallibility that it felt strange to let that go so simply, but it was necessary. After breakfast, he dressed in a simple suit, his movements careful and deliberate. There was no need to announce his intentions. Those who needed to know would find out soon enough. As he left the house, he could feel the quiet weight of history around him. For years he had walked these streets with confidence, his title acting as a shield. Now he walked as a man facing the consequences of his actions. The drive to the FBI headquarters was slow, almost meditative. He watched familiar streets pass by, noticing details he had ignored for years. The baker opening his shop, a child chasing a ball down the sidewalk, a couple walking hand in hand. Ordinary life moved on outside, oblivious to the drama that had consumed his own world. For the first time, he felt connected to it in a quiet, humbling way. Upon arrival, the usual security protocol seemed sharper than ever, though no one made any comment. His office was ready, the letter on his desk waiting for him to sign. He paused, taking a deep breath, feeling the enormity of the moment. Then with a calm hand, he placed the letter in an envelope, sealed it, and walked to the Attorney General's office. The Attorney General greeted him formally, yet with a hint of empathy. He handed over the envelope without a word. The exchange was simple, devoid of ceremony. In a way, it was the kind of closure the director needed, not a public spectacle. Not a defense of his actions, just an acknowledgement that this chapter was ending. Leaving the office, he felt the eyes of colleagues on him. Some filled with pity, others with quiet respect. It didn't matter. He had made peace with the fact that perception was beyond his control. What mattered was his own integrity and the understanding that he had faced the consequences of his actions honestly. The news of his resignation spread quickly. Cameras, reporters, and headlines followed, analyzing every detail. Social media exploded with commentary, some supportive, others critical, but the director stayed away from the noise. He spent the day quietly, walking through parks, observing life without the weight of authority. He noticed how people interacted, laughed, argued, and loved. There was beauty in simplicity, in moments he had long ignored while chasing power and control. Over the next few weeks, he settled into a slower rhythm. He read, walked, and reflected on the career he had dedicated his life to. He began reaching out to old mentors, colleagues, and even those he had disciplined or disagreed with during his career. Conversations were honest and human, stripped of titles and expectations. He listened more than he spoke, learning again how to see the world through other eyes. He also began mentoring younger agents informally, not in the role of director, but as a person with experience and lessons to share. He found that his words carried weight not because of a title but because of honesty. He spoke of humility, accountability, and the importance of respecting everyone regardless of their position. The lesson he had learned from that traffic stop, the moment that had changed everything, became the central theme of his guidance. In quieter moments, he would think back to the officer who had pulled him over. That man had done his duty without hesitation or fear. The simplicity of that action, the commitment to fairness, had humbled him profoundly. He realized that respect and integrity were not granted by rank or fame, but earned through everyday actions and choices. He began writing again, not letters, not reports, but a personal reflection on his life and career. The words flowed with honesty he had not allowed himself in decades. He wrote about mistakes, triumphs, lessons learned, and the human side of leadership. It was therapeutic, a way to process the upheaval and understand his own journey. He didn't intend to publish it immediately. It was for himself, a record of growth and humility. Days turned into weeks, and slowly the world moved on. Headlines changed, new controversies emerged, and his name faded from daily discussion. But he was no longer focused on the world's judgment. He had found a quiet purpose in reflection, mentorship, and understanding the value of everyday life. One afternoon, he went for a long drive along a country road, similar to the one where it had all begun. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange. He drove slowly, noticing the details he had missed for so long: the rustle of leaves in the wind, birds flying overhead, the laughter of children playing near a farm. The experience reminded him of life's small, irreplaceable moments. He stopped at a small roadside cafe, ordered a simple meal, and sat by the window. Watching people come and go, he felt a sense of peace he had never known while in office. He realized that authority had its moments of exhilaration, but connection, humility, and honesty offered something far more enduring. He watched a young couple laugh over their coffee, a child spill juice on the floor and be forgiven by a parent with a smile, and he felt a profound sense of belonging to the human experience he had long neglected. At home, he began spending more time with his family. Conversations were lighter, filled with shared stories and laughter. He listened without judgment, without the need to assert authority. Simple walks, dinners together, and evenings spent talking became the new measure of fulfillment. Power and position had once defined his life. Now, love, respect, and presence filled it. He also reconnected with friends from his early career, people who had been there when he was just starting. Conversations were honest, filled with shared memories, laughter, and mutual respect. He realized that relationships, not titles, were the true measure of life. Sometimes he would sit quietly, thinking about the officer again, about the traffic stop, and the moment when everything shifted. He understood now that life often teaches lessons in the smallest, most unexpected ways. A brief encounter, a simple act of fairness, had shown him humility and accountability more than any case or briefing ever could. In the following months, he became a mentor to anyone willing to listen. Not in an official capacity, but as someone who had seen the heights of power and the depths of personal challenge. He shared lessons about responsibility, humility, and the courage to admit mistakes. His story became a quiet inspiration to those who understood the weight of leadership and the human cost of pride. Eventually, he found time to reflect deeply on what truly mattered. Life was no longer about accolades, headlines, or authority. It was about human connection, compassion, and understanding. He cherished the small victories, the smile of a child, the laughter of family, a meaningful conversation with a friend. These moments were more powerful than any title he had ever held. On a late afternoon, he walked along the riverside near his home. The sun was low, casting warm light over the water. He watched the reflections ripple and felt the gentle breeze on his face. For the first time in a long time, he felt free. Free from judgment, free from expectation, and free from the relentless pursuit of control. He realized that true power came from within, the ability to be honest, to be humble, and to face life with courage. He had lost a title, a position, and the public's admiration, but he had gained clarity, peace, and a deeper understanding of himself. Life was no longer about proving something to the world. It was about being true to oneself. He had learned that respect is earned through action, humility, and integrity, not by the weight of a name. In the quiet of his home, he wrote one last note, not for anyone else but for himself. It was a reflection on the lessons learned, the mistakes made, and the growth achieved. He knew that life would continue, filled with challenges and unexpected moments, but now, he faced it with a heart grounded in humility, understanding, and human connection. As the sun set that evening, he stood by the window, watching the city lights come alive. He felt content, finally at peace with the choices he had made and the lessons he had learned. The world outside moved on, and so would he, carrying forward the wisdom of one small moment that had changed everything. Later that afternoon, he received a call from a White House official. The voice on the other end was firm but polite. The message was clear. The president was concerned. The controversy was becoming a political issue, and the administration wanted it resolved soon. He was advised to step back for a while, to let things cool down. But he knew what that meant. It meant they were preparing for his removal. He ended the call and leaned back in his chair. For a few minutes he sat in silence, staring at the ceiling. The feeling of control that had always defined him was slipping away. Every decision, every move he made was now being judged in public. Even those who had once supported him were staying quiet. At home that night, he avoided turning on the television. His wife tried to console him, reminding him of his years of service and the people he had helped. But he barely responded. His mind was stuck on one thought: how a simple traffic stop could destroy everything he had built. The following days were even worse. The internal investigation began, and agents he had mentored were now questioning his actions. Some avoided him entirely, afraid to be associated with the scandal. Others offered quiet sympathy but could do nothing. The press continued to dig deeper, revisiting old controversies from his career. Every misstep, every rumor resurfaced. He tried to continue his work as usual, attending meetings and giving briefings, but the respect that once filled the room was gone. Even his words carried less weight. It was as if people were waiting for him to fall. One morning, he received a message requesting his presence at the Department of Justice. The moment he read it, he knew it wasn't good. When he arrived, he was greeted formally but coldly. The Deputy Attorney General explained that the situation had become untenable. There were too many questions, too much public anger. The Bureau's image was suffering. The director listened quietly. He had no defense left to give. He was told to consider his options, either resign gracefully or face removal. The words echoed in his mind as he drove back to the office. The city looked different that day. Every building, every light seemed to remind him of his mistakes. In the following week, more pressure came from political figures and media commentators. The public demanded accountability. Some said his behavior showed how power could blind a person. Others argued he had simply made a human mistake. But the damage was done. His credibility, once unshakable, was gone. One evening, sitting alone in his office, he received a call from an old friend in law enforcement. The man spoke honestly. He told the director that sometimes losing control isn't the end. It can be a beginning, a lesson. The director thanked him, but deep down, he wasn't ready to believe that yet. Days passed and the pressure only grew. Cameras followed him everywhere. His home became a target for reporters. He couldn't step outside without seeing his face on a newspaper stand. He stopped reading comments and turned off his social media accounts. The world had turned against him, and he had no way to explain himself without making things worse. At the bureau, his staff avoided his office. He could hear whispers in the hallway, rumors about when he would leave, who might replace him, and how the agency would recover. The same people who once sought his approval now acted as if he didn't exist. One afternoon, he looked around his office and noticed the personal items that had followed him through his career. A family photo, an old badge from his early days, a letter of commendation from years ago. He realized how quickly things had changed. Everything that once gave him pride now felt like a memory from another life. The investigation concluded that his actions during the stop were inappropriate, but not criminal. Still, it wasn't enough to save him. The public trust had been broken. The Bureau's leadership was desperate to restore its image, and someone had to take responsibility. As the calls for his resignation grew louder, he spent one last night at the office. He turned off the lights, stood by the window, and watched the city below. For the first time, he allowed himself to think about what went wrong, how arrogance had blinded him, how a moment of frustration had led to his downfall. He thought about the officer, the one who had done everything by the book. He wondered if the man knew how much this had changed his life. Somewhere deep inside, he respected that officer now. The realization was humbling. Before leaving, he wrote a note to his deputy. It was short, just a few lines thanking the team for their work and reminding them to stay true to their duty. He didn't mention the scandal, the investigation, or the humiliation. He wanted his final message to be one of dignity, even if everything else had fallen apart. As he walked out of the building, the guards nodded quietly. There were no cameras this time, no reporters waiting outside. The city night was still. He took a deep breath, knowing that tomorrow would bring more headlines, more criticism, but also a kind of freedom he hadn't felt in years. He had spent his whole life in control, commanding, leading, and making decisions that shaped the country. Now, for the first time, he was just a man facing the consequences of his choices. It was painful, but it was also real. The next morning, his resignation letter was ready. He hadn't sent it yet, but he knew he would soon. He wanted to do it on his terms, not under pressure. He wanted to leave quietly, without anger or excuses. As he sat in his study, the morning light streamed through the window. His wife brought him coffee and sat beside him in silence. There were no words left to say. They both knew this was the end of one chapter and the uncertain beginning of another. Somewhere deep down, he hoped that time would soften the world's judgment. Maybe one day people would remember his years of service, not the mistake that ended it. But for now, he accepted the truth. That pride had cost him everything, and all he could do was face it with honesty. The world outside moved on, as it always does. The headlines would change, the public would find a new story, and life would continue. But for him, the lesson would remain forever. No matter how powerful a person becomes, humility is what keeps that power human. The words hung in the air. The director nodded slowly. He didn't argue, didn't plead. He simply stood there, feeling the weight of it settle in his chest. After a moment, he said quietly, "I understand." That evening, he drove home alone. The streets were wet from a light rain, and the reflections of streetlights shimmered on the pavement. His thoughts were heavy. Every turn reminded him of how fast things could change. A few months ago, he had been untouchable, the kind of man people saluted when he entered a room. Now he was being asked to walk away quietly. When he arrived home, he didn't tell anyone what had happened. He went straight to his study, turned on the small desk lamp, and sat down. For a long time, he just stared at the blank page in front of him. He knew he would have to write a letter, the kind of letter that marked the end of a chapter he had spent his entire life building. But before he could write anything, he thought about the journey that brought him here. He remembered his early days as a field agent, when he was still learning how to navigate the chaos of crime scenes and investigations. Back then, everything had been simple. He believed in justice, in doing the right thing no matter what. There were no cameras, no politics, no hidden agendas, just the work. He missed that. He missed being part of something pure. He thought about all the sacrifices, the birthdays he had missed, the long nights at the office, the risks he had taken. He had always believed it was worth it because it meant protecting people. But now, sitting there alone, he couldn't help but wonder if somewhere along the way, he had started protecting something else, his image, his pride. The next morning, he arrived at work early, before most of the staff. The halls were quiet. He walked slowly, taking in the familiar sights, the framed photos of past directors, the seal on the wall, the faint hum of machines waking up. For years, this building had been his second home. It was strange knowing that soon it wouldn't be his anymore. He sat at his desk and began writing. The words came slowly at first, but then they started to flow. He kept the letter short and sincere. He wrote about his gratitude for the opportunity to serve, about the people he had worked with, and about his belief in the Bureau's mission. He didn't make excuses. He didn't blame anyone. He ended the letter by saying that sometimes stepping aside is the best way to protect the integrity of the institution. When he finished, he read it over once, folded it neatly, and placed it in an envelope. He felt strangely calm. It was as if a burden had been lifted, not because he wanted to leave, but because he had finally accepted that he needed to. Later that day, he handed the letter to the Attorney General in a quiet meeting. No cameras, no crowd, just a simple exchange between two people who understood what it meant. When he walked out of the office, the world outside seemed brighter, almost peaceful. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel angry or defensive. He felt free, but freedom came with uncertainty. Without the title, without the position, who was he now? For so long, his identity had been tied to his job. People respected him because of what he represented, not necessarily for who he was. Losing that meant starting over, something he hadn't done in decades. That evening, as he drove through the city, he noticed things he had stopped paying attention to. The people walking their dogs, the street vendors closing up for the night, the sound of laughter from a nearby park. He realized how disconnected he had become from the world outside his work. Maybe this was life's way of forcing him to see it again. At home, he made himself a simple dinner and ate quietly. He didn't check the news. He didn't look at his phone. He just sat there, listening to the faint sound of rain tapping against the window. It felt almost like a new beginning, uncertain but real. The next morning, his resignation became public. The announcement spread quickly. News anchors read his statement, analysts debated what it meant, and social media was flooded with opinions. Some called it a dignified exit, others said it was overdue. But among all the noise, one simple truth remained. His career, as he knew it, was over. He received dozens of messages from colleagues, some expressing support, others offering quiet goodbyes. One message stood out. It was from the same officer who had pulled him over weeks earlier. It read, "Thank you for your message the other night. I know it wasn't easy. I respect your service." He read it twice, then smiled faintly. For all the chaos that moment had caused, it had also taught him something valuable, that respect isn't about rank or power. It's about how one handles the moments that test them. In the following days, he stayed out of the public eye. He spent his time walking through parks, reading and reflecting. Sometimes he would drive down quiet roads just to think. Each time he passed a patrol car, he would slow down and nod slightly, a small gesture of respect that came from a place of understanding. He wasn't sure what his future would look like. Maybe he would write a book, maybe teach, maybe just enjoy the quiet. But one thing was certain. He would never forget that night or the lesson it brought with it. The world had moved on quickly, as it always does. Another story took over the headlines, and soon his name began to fade from daily news. But for him, the change was permanent. The experience had stripped away everything unnecessary, leaving only the truth of who he was beneath the title. One evening, he stood by the window of his home, watching the sunset. The sky was painted with shades of gold and pink, and for the first time in a long time, he felt peace. He realized that sometimes losing what you thought defined you could be the only way to rediscover what truly matters. He wasn't the director anymore. He was just a man, flawed, humbled, and finally at ease with himself. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The agents exchanged glances. They didn't respond. After a moment, one of them said quietly, "There's talk that the Oversight Committee might want to review this officially. It's not just about public image, it's about integrity." The word integrity hit him harder than he expected. He had built his entire career around it. Every decision, every case, every speech, he had always prided himself on being the symbol of fairness and discipline. And now a single 5-minute encounter was putting all of that into question. That afternoon, he attended a scheduled press conference. The questions from reporters came fast. At first, they asked about bureau matters, but soon someone raised their hand and said, "Sir, regarding the viral video, do you believe your behavior was appropriate?" The room went quiet. He paused before answering. "I believe the incident has been blown out of proportion," he said finally. "I was tired and I may have come across as impatient, but there was no wrongdoing. I respect law enforcement at every level." The words sounded measured and calm, but deep down he knew they weren't enough. As soon as the press conference ended, the headlines twisted his statement into something else. Some said he showed arrogance. Others said he refused to take responsibility. The internet doesn't forgive easily, and it certainly doesn't forget. That night, while sitting alone in his office, he got a call from a high-ranking official from the Department of Justice. The voice on the other end was serious. "We're under pressure," the official said. "There are people in Congress asking questions. It would help if you issued a formal apology, something direct and sincere." The director didn't respond for a long moment. "If I do that," he said slowly, "it will make me look guilty." "It might also make you look human," the official replied before hanging up. He stared at the phone for a long time after the call ended. The idea of apologizing publicly bothered him deeply. In his world, showing weakness could end careers. But the longer he resisted, the worse things seemed to get. He turned off the lights in his office and drove home late that night, the city glowing faintly under the streetlights. He felt smaller somehow, as if the world he had built was starting to shrink around him. The following morning, he was greeted by reporters outside his house. Cameras flashed, microphones were pushed toward him, and questions filled the air. He didn't answer any of them. His driver helped him into the car and they sped away quickly. He knew it couldn't go on like this. Something had to change. That afternoon, he recorded a statement. Standing in front of a simple backdrop with the Bureau's emblem behind him, he took a deep breath and began to speak. "Over the past few days," he said, "a video of me has caused concern among the public. I want to say clearly that I respect every officer who serves our communities. My actions that evening did not reflect the patience and professionalism that I expect from myself. For that, I apologize." He kept it short, clear, and humble, or at least that's what he hoped it sounded like. When the video was released, reactions were mixed. Some appreciated the apology. Others said it came too late. But deep down, something inside him began to shift. For the first time, he felt the weight of his pride, and it didn't feel like strength anymore. It felt like a chain. That evening, he went for a walk near the river away from the noise of the city. The air was cool and the sound of the water calmed him. He thought about his early days in law enforcement, when he was young, idealistic, and driven by a genuine desire to serve. Somewhere along the way, ambition had blurred that purpose. He realized how much he had changed. The uniform he once respected had become something he looked down on. The humility he once had been replaced by the comfort of authority. A few days later, he received an official letter requesting his presence at an internal review hearing. The tone was formal, but the message was clear. His leadership was under question. When he walked into the room, he was met by a panel of officials, some familiar faces, some not. They asked about his behavior, his judgment, and his responsibility as a public figure. He answered calmly, but he could tell from their expressions that minds were already made up. After the meeting, he sat alone in the hallway for a long time. Through the window, he could see the same city he had sworn to protect, the same skyline that had once filled him with pride, but now it felt distant. He knew things would never be the same again. That night, he called the officer who had stopped him. It had taken him days to find the courage. When the officer answered, his voice was calm but cautious. The director introduced himself and said, "I just wanted to say, you were right to do your job. I didn't handle that moment well." There was a brief silence on the other end, then the officer replied, "I appreciate that, sir. I was just doing what anyone in my position would have done." It was a short conversation, but it lifted a small weight off his shoulders. For the first time since the incident, he felt a hint of peace. Still, he knew that the storm wasn't over. There were forces bigger than pride now: politics, perception, and power. And in that world, once the tide turned against you, it rarely turned back. He lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling. His mind wandered to the people he had once mentored, the promises he had made, and the values he had preached. Somewhere in that long, restless night, he finally understood what the officer had meant about the law applying to everyone. Titles fade, but actions stay. And sometimes it takes losing control to realize how little control we truly have. As he closed his eyes, he didn't think about his job or his reputation anymore. He thought about the road, the flashing lights, and the simple truth that had started it all, that respect is not demanded by power, but earned by humility and steady. He wasn't rude or confrontational, but he didn't look intimidated either. "Sir, I'm just doing my job," he replied. "This is a standard traffic stop. You are over the limit and I have to follow procedure." The director looked away, shaking his head slightly. He couldn't believe what was happening. In his mind, this should have been a quick conversation, a simple acknowledgement of his position, and then he could be on his way. But this young officer wasn't giving in. The silence stretched for a few seconds before the director spoke again. "You realize the kind of people I work with, right? This could be sorted out with one phone call," he said, his tone a mix of irritation and warning. The officer didn't respond right away. He looked at the director for a moment, then said quietly, "With respect, sir, the law applies to everyone. I'll just need your signature on this citation and you can be on your way." The director felt his face heat up. His pride stung. He had spent years enforcing laws, yet now he was being lectured about them. He hesitated, then finally took the pen and signed the ticket. The officer handed him back his documents. "Drive safely, sir," the officer said before walking back to his car. The director sat still for a moment, gripping the steering wheel tightly. His jaw clenched as he watched the patrol car pull away. The night felt heavier now. He started the engine but didn't move immediately. He couldn't shake off the feeling of humiliation. It wasn't about the fine, it was about how powerless he had felt in that moment. Someone beneath his rank had made him follow the rules, and that bruised his ego deeply. He drove home quietly, the road stretching endlessly before him. The more he thought about the incident, the angrier he became. He felt wronged, disrespected, and misunderstood. When he finally reached home, he didn't even take off his coat. He went straight to his study, poured himself a glass of water, and sat down, replaying the whole event in his mind. He imagined how it looked. Him, the nation's top law enforcement officer, being stopped like a common citizen. The thought made him restless. He picked up his phone, tempted to call someone in the bureau to complain about the officer's behavior, but he stopped himself. What would he even say? That an officer did his job correctly? That he was treated like anyone else? He realized how absurd it would sound, but pride doesn't fade easily. He couldn't sleep that night. He tossed and turned, thinking about how unfair it felt. He convinced himself that the officer must have recognized him and wanted to prove a point. He believed the stop wasn't random, it was deliberate. The more he thought, the more his imagination twisted the situation into something personal. By morning, the incident had already found its way into whispers. Someone had captured part of it on a phone, the flashing lights, the tense exchange, and a few words that were hard to hear clearly. The clip made its way to social media, and within hours it was spreading fast. People didn't know the full story, but they had opinions. Some sided with the officer, praising his professionalism. Others said the director was being unfairly judged. The comment section filled with debates, jokes, and speculations. At the FBI headquarters, a few staff members had seen the video by the time the director walked in. They didn't say anything, but the atmosphere felt strange. He could sense that people were aware, though they tried to act normal. Every handshake felt different, every greeting quieter. His assistant avoided eye contact. The day dragged on and every conversation seemed distant. In meetings, he found himself distracted. His mind kept returning to the flashing lights and the officer's steady tone. The moment replayed like a broken record. He wished he could undo it, but pride wouldn't let him admit that maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong. Later that evening, he sat alone again, watching the same clip online. It was all over the news now, and reporters were speculating about his behavior. Some defended him, saying that stress could make anyone react sharply. Others said the video showed arrogance from a person who believed he was untouchable. Each headline cut deeper than the last. He thought about calling the officer, maybe to clear the air, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. His position demanded strength, not apology. At least that's what he told himself. But deep inside, a small voice kept whispering that this small moment might become something much bigger. The next few days didn't help. News channels replayed the clip constantly, slowing it down, analyzing every word, every expression. His phone buzzed with messages from colleagues and old friends asking what had happened. Some sent words of support, others stayed silent, the kind of silence that speaks louder than words. He attended a press conference later that week, standing tall and composed. He addressed unrelated matters but could feel the unspoken questions in the room. Reporters waited for him to mention the stop, but he didn't. He pretended it didn't exist. Yet everyone knew the story wasn't over. That evening, as he sat by the window watching the city lights flicker, he thought about how fragile power really was. One small moment, a traffic stop on a quiet road, had the power to shake his confidence and image. He realized that even the highest titles couldn't protect someone from their own pride. He closed his eyes, trying to calm his thoughts, but the image of those flashing lights wouldn't leave him. The sound of the siren echoed in his memory like a warning that sometimes the fall doesn't come from enemies or big scandals. Sometimes it begins with something as simple as refusing to accept that you're just like everyone else.